was arrested on suspicion of murder. Candy wasted no time in rallying behind her nephew. She flew to Houston and hired top defense attorneys Percy Foreman and William F. Walsh to represent Melvin. A few weeks after their initial arrest, the police made their second arrest in the murder of Jacques Mossler. presented a case showing Melvin and Candy wanted Jack dead so they could be together and inherit his millions. It was estimated that Jack's estate was worth over $200 million in gross value and $22 million in net value, over $1.6 billion gross and over $177 million in net value today. The prosecution backed up their claim of an affair with photographs. Candy and Mel had travelled a lot and documented their trips with snapshots of them on the ski slopes, at concerts and in nightclubs, and they all showed what looked like a happy couple. They told the jury that Jacques had recently learned of his wife's affair with her nephew, and in response, Jacques was planning a divorce and dropping her from his will. This sudden change of events is what caused Melvin to fly from Houston to Miami. He was seen driving Candy's white car around the time of the murder in the area. Then hours before the time of death, Melvin was at the Stuffed Shirt Lounge near Key Biscayne, where he was drinking. Before leaving, he asked the bartender for an empty Coke bottle. The prosecution